Buenas tardes. Before I start speaking, I'm going to just take a moment to talk about my friend Rick. As Rick said, we've known each other for many years. We've been through a lot of battles together. We've been in the trenches. Has anybody seen that movie In the Heights yet? Raise your hand. And the play. There's a character in that movie called Abuela Claudia. And Abuela Claudia is not necessarily everybody's physical blood relative, right? But in our community, in many cases, we have family that we choose. Doesn't have to be just blood relatives, right? I grew up in New York City, in Brooklyn, in one of the worst neighborhoods in the country, in Bushwick. We say things like, when I have a dear friend, I call him my brother, hermano. We use those terms a lot, right? And you've heard us, I'm sure, when we speak to each other, hermano. Sometimes it's just a term, and sometimes we mean it. In my case, with my friend Rick, that's my hermano. He's been to my home, I've been to his. Over the years, whenever we've needed someone, the first person I'll turn to is Rick. He's consistent, he's reliable, he's there for you no matter what. There are very few people like that, so Rick has made a lot of great things happen, and he's someone that deserves our respect, admiration, and consistency. Thank you, Rick, for everything you've done. So, having said that, now I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we've done with this initiative. For me, coming back here to St. Paul is like coming home. I've come here many times over the years for a lot of different reasons. Even though my home originally is New York, my home for the last 30 years has been outside of the Washington, D.C. area. And those of you that have been to Washington, you know that it's a city of politics, it's a city of power plays, and monuments and so forth. You may not know, though, that it's also a city of museums. There are about 70 museums in the D.C. area. Big museums, small museums, art galleries, etc. But the cream of the crop has always been the 17 national museums within the Smithsonian Institution portfolio. And if you go to the National Mall, that's what you'll see. A lot of these museums. Included among them are a couple of the newer ones, the National Museum of American Indian and the National Museum of African American History and Culture, which before COVID was one of the top visited museums in the world. Unfortunately, what you won't see is an American Latino museum. And it's unfortunate because there really ought to be one. There ought to be a museum on the National Mall to celebrate and commemorate the over 500 years of Latino contributions to the building, shaping, defending of this nation from the very beginning. You can applaud that. Sure, Andy. Because we have to know where we came from to know where we are now and where we're going in the future. Have you ever seen those movies where you go back in the past, you alter something in the past and it changes your present, right? You've seen those movies, right? Imagine a United States of America without roughly the lower half of the country. Well, we don't have to, because for over 500 years, Latinos have been founding and settling communities across much of the U.S. territory. You know, we're taught in elementary school that the American story begins when the British get to Jamestown, Virginia in 1607 to establish the first permanent British settlement. That's what we're told in elementary school. Well, unfortunately, that's historically inaccurate. As far as I'm concerned, it starts 114 years before that, on Columbus's second voyage into the world, when he arrives on the shores of what is now U.S. territory in Puerto Rico. So the story of American expansion doesn't necessarily go from Virginia to the north and to the south. It goes from the Caribbean up to Florida, on to Alabama and Mississippi, Texas and California, as far north as Wyoming. So by the time the British get to Jamestown in 1607, there's already been a bunch of Latinos saying, bienvenidos, so it took you so long. In fact, I tell my friends from Alabama, I tell them, you're basically a bunch of Latinos several generations removed. So that's the real story of America. Over 500 years that Latinos have been here making a difference. Imagine also if General Washington had not won the War of Independence. Well, we don't have to, because Spanish General Bernardo de Galvez, along with over 11,000 Spanish troops coming from the Caribbean and Central America and Florida and other places, were there to help stem the advance of the British from the south. Imagine if the Navy of the United States did not have its first full admiral during the Civil War who said those immortal words, "Damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead." We don't have to, because the first full admiral of the United States Navy was David Farragut, more accurately pronounced David Farragut, whose biological father was a Spanish soldier who fought in the Revolutionary War. There's even a metro station in DC named after him. Imagine if we didn't have the over 500,000 Latino troops fighting in World War II in every theater of that war making a difference. Imagine the Korean conflict without the exploits of the U.S. Army's 65th Infantry Regiment, Borinqueneers of Puerto Rico, setting the gold standard for the bravery of a combat unit. Imagine going to the Vietnam Veterans Memorial and not seeing the thousands of Hispanic surnames etched on that wall, or the young, brave Latinas and Latinos fighting and sacrificing on our behalf in the battlefields of Afghanistan and Iraq, or the over 60 Hispanic Medal of Honor recipients. As an Air Force veteran myself, I'm here to tell you Latinos take a backseat to no one in the defense of liberty. Imagine Major League Baseball without a strong cadre of Latino players on virtually every team. An era of Latinos in baseball that was helped to be ushered in by one of my personal heroes, Roberto Clemente, who faced discrimination because he was both black and Latino, who helped usher in the era of Latinos in baseball. Number 21, and we really should get that number retired, shouldn't we?
Right, yes, we should.
Imagine television, sitcoms, where there's only one camera, or maybe two. We don't have to, because innovator Desi Arnaz came up with the idea of a 3-camera shot in a live studio audience. And speaking of television, imagine if we didn't have strong women portrayed on television, and women are now portrayed in strong roles because of Linda Carter, who also was a Latina, who starred as Wonder Woman in the 1970s. Well, all of these things are possible because of the Latino contributions over the last 500 years, because we've been relying on Latinos to fight our wars and to run our businesses, to tend our fields and to mend our wounds, to teach our kids, patrol our streets, and share the word of God. So, contrary to what some might have you believe, Latinos are not a recent patch being sewn onto the tapestry of America. We are an essential foundational thread woven into the very fabric of America.
Right. Wow.
Imagine if we didn't have Latino workers today in our farms and in our factories, in our hotels and in our hospitals, in our restaurants and in our research laboratories, in our sanitation departments and in our Supreme Court of the United States, in our movie sets and in our radio studios and our music studios. So this is the time where we can celebrate and commemorate those 500 years of contributions looking at the past. But it's not enough. We also have to look at the present and look at the future. We need to educate the public about the diversity that exists within our community. We are Afro-Latinos, we're Asian Latinos, we're blonde-haired and blue-eyed, we are mulattos and mestizos and Native Americans and everything in between. You know, I did Ancestry DNA recently. I found out that I'm a genetic sancocho. A genetic stew. I'm 50% Iberian, I am Native American, I'm African, I'm Western European, but that's us. We're not a race, we're a culture. We're a culture made up of some very shared foundational fundamental values around family and faith and optimism and passion and pride, and those are the qualities most in need in our country today. We are today, we know the numbers, we're nearly 20% of the population. $2 trillion in purchasing power, a significant aspect of our society, and it's only growing, because it's not enough to be able to honor our ancestors, we also need to inspire our descendants. And that's a big part of what this museum is about, because if we look to the future, the Census Bureau tells us that by the year 2060, Latinos will make up 30% of the population, as shown here. So by 2060, if you look to your left and to your right and they're not Latinos, then guess what? It's probably you. So as we went about this effort, and I'll show you the timeline in a second. So it began in 1994 when the Smithsonian Institution itself created a task force to see how they were doing in terms of portraying Latino contributions in their exhibits. That task force came back with a report. You know what the name they chose for that report? Willful neglect. Saying not only was the Smithsonian doing a poor job, it's as if they were doing it on purpose, leaving those contributions out of the exhibits and out of the museums. So among the 10 recommendations of the Willful Neglect report was the creation of a national American Latino museum to be able to start to fill in those missing stories in the museums and the missing pages in our history books. It took several years to actually get a bill passed in Congress to create a commission to study the feasibility of it. That bill to create that commission was first introduced in 2003. It didn't pass until 2008 and was signed by President Bush. I was appointed to that commission by John Boehner, along with 22 other individuals, including people like Eva Longoria and Emilio Estefan. We came together, the 23 of us, very different people from different walks of life. We came together as a family immediately, and we traveled all over the country, getting input from citizens. And what we learned were three basic things. Number one, there was a clear and pressing need for the museum. Number two, it really should be part of the Smithsonian Institution. And number three, it really ought to be on the National Mall. 25 million visitors come to the National Mall every year to go to the museums. We should be one of those museums. When we delivered our report to Congress and President Obama in May of 2011, the title we chose for our report was to illuminate the American story for the benefit of all Americans, Latinos, non-Latinos, Americans and those coming to our country to get a better sense of who we are as a people. Because at the end of the day, we really do need to be able to tell a more complete and accurate version of American history. Well, that year, in 2011, was the first time that an authorization bill was introduced in Congress to create this museum. Because to create a Smithsonian Museum, you literally need an act of Congress. There's a 501c3, Friends of the National Museum of American Latino, formed to be able to shepherd along that legislation. In December of 2016, I became the chairman of that organization. And we went about the effort to try to get this bill passed in Congress. And I'm happy to report that on December 21st, my birthday, 2020, that bill passed in Congress. 6 days later, it was signed by President Trump, 4 days before the end of my term as chairman, and it is now the law of the land. It only took 26 years to be able to get that done.
500 years.
I will tell you what, though, it wasn't an easy process, and I'll show you some of the details, but you can see here in this timeline that the bill passed unanimously in the House of Representatives in July of 2020. Passed unanimously. In November, was brought up for a unanimous consent vote in the Senate. You know what happened? It was killed by one senator, Senator Lee of Utah. He's killed. So what did we do? We went to Plan B. Because you always got to have a Plan B, right? Plan B was to get it included in the must-pass omnibus bill, which we did, because we were some sly individuals. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the commission so you can see what it was about. It really was a family that came together on the steps of the Capitol to make sure that we did right, not only by our community, but by our country, to be able to tell the story of America. The reason that I've been involved in this effort for so many years is because I do have a vision of a young Latina born today, right here in St. Paul. And on her 6th grade field trip, She can go to Washington, D.C., and she can marvel at the monuments, and she can visit Capitol Hill, and she can go to all the national museums, including the American Latino Museum, and she can walk through that museum and see all these stories that I've been talking about and leave that museum proud, not only to be a Latina, but proud to be an American. This effort has been a labor of love. Started when President Bush signed the bill. This commission delivered its report to Congress and President Obama in 2011. Along the way, we visited sites. We talked to the community. It was one of my great honors in my life to lay a wreath at the Fallen Soldiers Memorial in San Juan, Puerto Rico. And then, after the commission was done with its work, it was up to the 501c3 Friends Group to carry the ball to the finish line. And that's what we did. Over the 4 years that I was chairman, we did everything we could to get that bill passed. We employed every marketing technique that you can think of, because this was, at the end of the day, a combination of both government relations, public affairs, marketing, public relations, the whole 9 yards. Everything. There were a lot of plates that we had to keep spinning. And if any one of those plates fell down, the entire effort would end in disaster. So this was very much walking a tightrope to get this thing done. We had different leaders in Congress and champions that we had to recruit, including Will Hurd that you see in the top left. After Ileana Ross-Leighton retired, our champion on the Republican side of the House, we needed to find a new champion in the House on the Republican side. We sat in his office, and you can tell, he's almost 6.5 feet tall. We talked to him, and at the end of that conversation, when he agreed to it, he stood up, and I looked at him and said, Patri, Fili, Spiritu Sancti, you're now our champion. We need you to get this done. We did traditional media. We did digital marketing, advertising. We brought people together, and you can see our friend Rick right here in the picture. He was there from the beginning as well. And what we did was something unusual, something unprecedented, something disruptive, to use Dr. Jake's term. At a time of historic division, tribalism, partisanship, rancor, what we did was pull together a national, positive, bipartisan coalition focused on accomplishing something and getting something done that was tangible. And guess what? We showed America not only what could be done, but how to get it done. This was a historic effort. We did everything that we had to do in Congress, but that wasn't enough. We needed to get the public on our side. 400,000 followers that we had to mobilize and activate and make sure that they were part of the effort to push this legislation to the finish line. This never coasted. This was never downhill. Every step of the way was pushing the boulder up the hill. And it was never a fait accompli. It was never assured that we'd be able to make it happen. We had to work with the Trump administration every step of the way. We had to testify in the Senate to make it happen. And we had to pressure congressional leaders to make it happen. And the only way that we were able to do that was by being able to mobilize and activate our cadre, our coalition of followers and supporters. And we got it done. As it says on the bottom, the dream is now a reality. Right now, as we speak, the Smithsonian Institution has appointed the initial 17 members of the Board of Trustees. I'm on the search committee to find the first permanent executive director of the museum. We are going to be selecting a site, a location on the National Mall for this museum. That's going to be a big fight. And we're going to have to raise $350 million. Not a small task. But I guarantee, I promise you here today, that in 8 to 10 years, you will be able to walk into the Smithsonian National American Latino Museum with your families. There will be a powerful, robust, substantial virtual presence, but my guess is that there's no replacement for being able to sit down in this museum physically and experience it with others. So this museum will become a mecca for the Latino community, coming to the nation's capital to see this museum and then go to the other museums in Washington, D.C., understanding the context within which it exists. The African American Museum, Native American Museum, the American History Museum. This is not separate, apart, distinct. This is part of a compendium, a portfolio of museums that allows you to understand the American experience. I will tell you that there were a lot of lessons learned as well. I'll go through some of them. Number one, persistence made all the difference in the world. We talked earlier about I'm cabeciduro. I'm stubborn. It was really easy to give up over the years. I can't tell you the number of people that told us over and over again, it's just a pipe dream, it's never gonna happen, just give up, just throw in the towel. It's too hard. You're never gonna be able to convince people to make it happen. So we didn't give up, we kept at it. Second point is, get the messaging right and use it over and over again. I'm a big believer in the 5 C's of messaging. It's gotta be clear and concise, it has to be compelling, it has to connect with your audience, and it has to be continual, over and over again. So we took messaging that had been talking about social justice and so forth, all good and proper things, and we turned it into a messaging about a more complete and accurate telling of American history, the patriotic contributions of this community to the building, shaping, and defending of this country. That was the messaging that we took to the community and we took to Congress, and it worked. And we kept at it over and over and over again. The other thing that I realized as my role as chairman is that as a leader, you have to define reality and visualize the end goal. If I had stepped in as chairman and said, you know what, I don't know, we'll see what happens, we have to react to whatever the market forces are. No, you have to define reality, and you have to say, this is what success looks like. And that's what allowed us to be able to take not only our community along this ride of several years, but also the mainstream community, also members of Congress, everybody involved in public affairs. We took them on this ride because there was a definable reality and definable vision that we all had set. The next point is plan and prepare. We literally, as I said earlier, employed every tactic under the sun. And we put it in a plan that was both flexible, but also definable, and we executed, right? So define a plan, prepare what you have to do to make it happen, be flexible, but execute the plan. Work the plan. Next bullet is build coalitions. We had over 100 national organizations as part of our coalition, left, right, center. From business groups to academic groups to civil rights organizations, we built the broadest coalition we could possibly gather, not just within the Latino community, but the African American community, the Asian community, Jewish community, LGBT community. Everybody was involved in making this Latino museum happen. We built that coalition from the ground up. Next point is leverage any and all relationships. One of the key moments is when we got Senator Ted Cruz on board as a co-sponsor, who wasn't supporting this ever. Over the years that we had this done, he never stood up to support this at all, for a lot of reasons, or for no reasons. We knew, though, to be able to get more Republican support in the Senate, we needed to get him on board. So there were calls that I had at 2 o'clock in the morning with folks that were close to him or close to his donors, close to his family. So he heard from at least a dozen different sources that this was something that he needed to support. When it finally happened and we made it public, then the door started opening up and we got more Republican support in the Senate. Plan, execute, build relationships, and leverage it. That's how we were able to get that happen. Next step is to engage the media at every level, traditional media, non-traditional media. I was out there all over the place. My executive director was out there all over the place. Our board members were out there all over the place. Our supporters were out there. We got celebrities, and we got anybody that we could that was an influencer or an opinion leader involved in the media to be able to spread the word out, because that's a force multiplier. Unless you have an unlimited budget to do paid media or advertising, you need to leverage earned media and influencers to be able to get your message out there. That's what we did there. And then finally, digital is a force multiplier. So we did do digital advertising, but we also did some guerrilla marketing. We did some community organizing, and we leveraged digital and social media to be able to spread the word and activate people to contact their members of Congress, to write letters, to sign on to petitions. And then at the end of the day, none of this happens without everyone being involved and everyone feeling like they contributed, they were part of the solution, they were part of success. So let everyone own the success. And at the end of the day, I will say to you what I said to everyone that was involved in this process: thank you. Thank you for your time, thank you for your attention, and thank you to the millions of people that helped us make this a reality for our community and for our country. So thank you for your time. I'm happy to take any questions that you might have.
Thank you so much for so many years of hard work on behalf of, I think, everyone who hopes to be able to enjoy the museum and our children after us. I was wondering if you have any plans to have a performance area in the museum, because music and dance and performance is so important to our culture.
Que calor, que calor, que calor. Absolutely. I think there needs to be a performing arts component to this museum. I think that really is endemic to our community. It's in our DNA, right, as a community. So I think there absolutely needs to be a performing arts portion. The other thing I promise everybody that I talked to about this effort is that if nothing else, I guarantee this will have the best food court in the history of mankind. Am I right? Another question. Any other questions? Sir?
Hey Rick, how did you know that you had to change your message? What was telling you to pivot?
That's an excellent question. The question was, how did I know that we had to change the messaging and pivot? The first authorization bill was introduced in the fall of 2011. That initial bill didn't get a whole lot of traction, a whole lot of co-sponsors. It had to get reintroduced in the following Congress, because every 2 years there is a new Congress, right? It was reintroduced in the following Congress, maybe a couple more co-sponsors. As we were talking to legislators directly in their offices and their staff, what we started to hear was that there was a lot of concern, particularly among Republicans, about the content of this museum. They were concerned that it would have a specific political bent to it, that it would only be, focused on this one small aspect. So it was going nowhere. The bill was actually languishing in Congress. So it got reintroduced a third time, and again, very small number of supporters. So we said, when I came in as chairman, I said, we've got to do something different. It's not working. So as we spoke to more lawmakers, we heard their concerns, we listened to what they were worried about, and we said, well, what they're saying is something that we would want to do anyway, but the misperceptions were out there because the messaging wasn't right? So as a marketer, you know that perception is reality, right? So that if that was the perception, if it was leading to not what we needed it to get to, we said, let's change the messaging, and not to be disingenuous about it, but to be more, but to clarify what it is that the intention is. That's when we said, this has to be about a more complete, accurate telling of American history. about celebrating and commemorating the 500 years of contributions to the building, shaping, defending of this nation, and to inspire future generations. Full stop. Clear, concise messaging that really resonated and connected with the audience in a compelling way. So that's how we were able to get that done. But that was key. That was key first step.
Dan, tell us about the location issue. This is
Yeah.
something we have to understand and where our push is going to be.
Sorry. Okay. That's, for you, those of you that haven't been to Washington, D.C., at the middle top there, that's the United States Capitol, the seat of democracy, right? Here is the Washington Monument, right here, right? That rectangle there, from there to here, and from Independence to Constitution Avenues, that's the National Mall, America's backyard, right? What do you see along the sides there? Buildings. Those are all, most of them are museums, right? Do you see a whole lot of empty space? No, not a whole lot of empty space. There are a couple of spots. There's, so the African American Museum is down here, right? Over here, there's sort of a green field, empty space, right? On the Senate side of the Capitol, so the House side is on this side, the Senate side is over here. There's a green space there as well. And there's one or two existing buildings. So here, I'm sorry, I'm going to use a pointer. This is the administrative part of the Smithsonian, known as the castle, right? It's never been a museum, it's always been administrative. Next to it is the Arts and Industries building, which was the first building ever used as a Smithsonian museum. It had been under reconstruction for the last almost 20 years because it was structurally unsound. It's now going to reopen with exhibits for the public in the coming literally days. That was one of the museums that we looked at as a commission. The problem with that building is that it's very old, which means a historic landmark, so you've got to jump through hoops to be able to use it for anything nowadays. And it's not really established to be a modern museum, right? Humidity control, all that stuff, lighting and whatnot. For us to be able to use that building as a museum, and it's not very big either, we'd have to build underground. So we'd have to figure out if there were issues. The African American Museum had issues because when they built underground, there were waterways that they weren't aware of. Right, so that delayed the process by about 2 years. The fight right now is that when we were able to get the bill passed, there were two senators in particular that wanted to keep the green space that's down here, they wanted to keep that green grass. So the only way that we were able to get the bill passed was to include that reserve would be kept reserved for green space. So right now we're going to have to fight. If we want to stay on the National Mall, we have to fight for one of those locations. Either that green space down here, or the Senate side, Arts and Industries, or Department of Agriculture has a building as well. That would have to be vacated so we could use it. Otherwise, there's a discussion going on right now to sort of redefine the National Mall, right? So it would expand it in different directions. The fight is going to be about being able to convince those senators to give up the reserve or to use the Senate side, or to find a way to be able to use Arts and Industries. But we know that as a founding community of this nation, we know that as a community that has built this country, that will be 30% of the population, we will be fighting for a location on the National Mall.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
So Danny, you've traveled all over the country looking at, talking to a lot of folks about this, probably even outside the country a little bit of this. What precedence is there throughout the world with respect to honoring Latinos in maybe different countries, or are there any other precedents in the United States? And how significant will this be as a global destination for the Latino community?
That's a good question. Thank you, Andy, for that question. So, one, the United States is very unique in that it has such a large minority population within a particular demographic group. 20% of the population is Latino. We are actually the second biggest Hispanic population in the world behind Mexico, right? The United States with 60 million people. Having said that, though, I think the precedent in terms of having a museum dedicated to a particular demographic group is not unseen or unknown. One in the United States, as I said earlier, we've got the National Museum of the American Indian, National Museum of African American History and Culture, and the reason that there is a need for those museums is that a lot of those stories were not included in the mainstream museums, but also because of the fact that it requires a different lens, a different perspective to be able to understand the story. So if you've seen on some of these crime dramas on TV, you know, where there's an incident, right, and they're witnesses. And depending on who you ask, depending on where they were standing, their perspective of a particular incident, their view of it was a little bit different than somebody else that was standing in a different location, right? So getting that perspective from that population is important, it's enriching, it allows you to better understand the narrative of the entire story to be able to get that perspective from that lens, right? And then the other thing that we heard traveling all over the country and Puerto Rico was that there was a need to tell that story because it wasn't being told in our history books and it wasn't being told in our museums. And there are existing Hispanic and Latino museums and cultural centers throughout the country for a particular demographic group or geographic area, but there's no overarching museum that can tell the story. I will tell you, I'm not looking forward to the challenge that this executive director is going to face, being able to tell the story of a population that's been here for 500 years, 60 million people, 24 different countries of origin. The diaspora, the journey through time and space is going to be incredibly challenging because it's going to be history, art, and culture. So the challenge, how do you tell that story in a space that people can absorb within a 4 or 5 hour visit to a museum? People go to the African American Museum. When they were building it, they thought people would stay for 3 or 4 hours. People were staying 6 to 8 hours in this museum, right? So if you've never been to the African American Museum, you start in the basement, right? And you start in what feels like the bowels of a slave ship. And then you go up through the museum. I've always said that the measure of a great museum is a place that takes you on a journey where you walk in the museum one person, and then when you walk out after experiencing it, you're a different person, right? So that's what we hope to be able to have this museum be, something that's transformative. Yes, sir.
So one of the lessons you learned from the African American Museum is that be careful about going in the ground because you might have a river flowing through it. But was there any other lessons? I mean, because they're the most recent one in the mall.
Yeah.
In terms of acquiring space, like how was there something there that they had to displace, and what was the process that they went through to get that space, even if it was some senator's favorite frisbee spot?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good question. Yes, a lot of lessons learned from them. They were able to sort of plant their flag on that space because the language that they had in their bill sort of gave them the ability to just step in and plant the flag wherever they wanted in the National Mall. After that, senators and members of Congress learned that, oh, oops, we didn't include language to say you've got to get our approval first, right? So that was one of the lessons learned. So we had to work hard to try to get some language in there. The second thing we learned was that the Latino Museum is going to be the first museum in the 170-year history of the Smithsonian Institution that by its founding charter will require the diversity of political viewpoints included in its exhibits. That was something that was included on the Republican side to be able to make sure that it had sort of a broad description of the sort of the political ideology spectrum included. Because that was something that the African American Museum didn't have, and a lot of folks were upset about that. So that language was included. The third thing we learned from the African American Museum experience was the fundraising, the major fundraising, do it early, do it often, get as much as you can, as early as you can. They had to raise $270 million to open the doors. It wasn't until the later years, like almost right before the grand opening that they were able to hit that mark because they sort of didn't do the major giving component until later in the process. So with this museum, we're going to do the major giving focus early on, as early as possible, and get as big of a chunk of the target as we possibly can up front. So that way, as we coast to the later years, it'll be less of a heavy lift. But we also learned in terms of curating and collecting items for it, go out there as broad, as wide as you can. Lonnie Bunch, who is now the secretary of the Smithsonian, was the founding executive director of the African American Museum before he became secretary. And he went all over the country, and he's still got collections that haven't even gotten to the museum because he's got so much stuff. So going all over the country and getting those items is really important. Any other questions? Sir?
In 2010, Latinos artists from across the country got together in Los Angeles, and the museum was then the topic. And at the same time, so was the Cheech, the Mexican Museum, and the museum in New York, which was in financial troubles.
Mhm.
And Houston wanted to create, every Latino, virtually, they wanted to have a museum. The question was, and it was, it went from the conference to the hallway, to the bar, to the middle of the night, people yelling at each other, is it's gonna be a big financial drain. What's the strategy to making all of those different interests come together and coalesce around behind this one?
Mm-hmm. Excellent question. So I was in Los Angeles, I was in Austin, I was in Puerto Rico, I was in New York, I was in all those places where we had those same conversations at the same time. In the legislation, so it's required, is the fact that the National Museum of the American Latino will also support the other regional and local Latino and Hispanic museums and cultural institutions, because it has to be I don't want to use the term hub spoke because it's not the intention, but it's an opportunity to be able to highlight what they're doing with the rest of the country, and then also be able to share what's happening with the National Museum into those local and regional institutions. This really has to be, and the African American Museum did the same thing with a lot of the existing African American museums and cultural institutions around the country at the local level. This will follow a similar model, and that there will be that relationship, that partnership, that ability to give and take and support those local institutions, because without those, the National Museum can only do so much, right? It can't dive deep into the aspects in New Mexico, right, that are different than Texas, that are different than California. It's going to take those local and regional folks to dive really deep into those experiences at that local and regional level. So we can't rob Peter to play Paul. We've got to make sure that this National Museum supports those local and regional institutions, for sure. Any other questions? No? With that, thank you so much, folks. I appreciate it very much.